It's a lofty goal to be a great fighter who's known for highlight reel knockouts. It's another lofty goal to be popular in your home country with fans of a particular sport, or amongst your own ethnic or cultural demographic. But to be a crossover star, the cover of the video game, the fighter known to the guy at 7-Eleven who only tunes in for the big pay-per-views. That is rarefied air that only a handful of names in the history of the sport have even aspired to. Israel Adesanya is one of those names. From the moment of his signing with the UFC in 2018 to his meteoric rise to the middleweight championship to the huge upset loss that derailed his career, Adesanya has spent his entire career under a spotlight that is incredibly rare, even for a sport with the phenomenal reach of the modern UFC. He announced his UFC arrival with a wipeout performance in his backyard of Perth, Australia on a pay-per-view. Then he followed that up with a series of fights that highlighted not only his tremendous technical skill, but also his willingness to engage in toe-to-toe wars, the kinds of fights and performances that make fans want to see more. He won the title in storybook fashion, kicked off by a walkout that I honestly didn't know was allowed in the UFC anymore. He then justified that hyped walkout by demolishing a respected champion in front of a capacity hometown crowd. To most MMA fans, the future of MMA was born right before our eyes. He had the look, the passport, and the style to carry MMA to a whole new fan base around the world. He was admired, you can even say revered, from New Zealand to Africa to America. So how did it all go wrong? And perhaps more importantly, can he rise again at the MMA retirement age of 35? In the modern landscape of MMA, a fighter rarely makes their UFC debut with a ton of hype. The Ultimate Fighter doesn't produce contenders like it used to, and success on Dana White's Contender Series doesn't always translate to success in the octagon. I'm looking at you, Greg Hardy. And educated fans generally know that. Unless you're a rare Bellator signing like Michael Chandler or MVP, you are just another fighter in a long line with championship dreams. Israel Adesanya was the exception to that rule. He was 11-0 in MMA with 11 knockouts when I called his debut in Perth, Australia back in 2018 against solid middleweight Rob Wilkinson. He wasn't just an undefeated mixed martial artist. He was also a standout kickboxer who boasted a record of 75-5. But beyond the numbers, the guy had it. Whatever it is, he had that unique swagger that seemed to combine youthful energy and a kind of I belong here experience level. What I remember vividly before his debut in Perth was his act of pretending to urinate on the octagon as he made his entrance. True story. As if to say, this is my turf now. I remember thinking, well, you're confident, but now you better win, and you better win big. Well, that's exactly what he did, decimating Rob Wilkinson with strikes in round 2 and earning himself Performance of the Night honors in the process. Then he followed that up with a solid, if unspectacular, win over Marvin Vettori and another fight that I called against Brad Tavares. After these wins, his star was on the rise. He crushed perennial gatekeeper Derek Brunson before going the distance with the faded former champ Anderson Silva. The head-turning fight for a lot of fans came when he took on Kelvin Gastelum in April of 2019 for the interim middleweight title. This was an all-out war, the first real test of Adesanya's MMA career. He had a close one with Vettori, but had never really been in any physical danger. He was rocked multiple times against the shorter but still powerful Gastelum, and yet found a way to stay in the fight and answer back with power of his own. It was the marriage of skill and heart that doesn't just make a great fighter, but also cements a fighter as a fan favorite. This performance guaranteed him a showdown in Australia with middleweight champ Robert Whittaker. In my experience, there are fights and there are events. This was an event. Everything about this card felt big. From the arena, to the dancing intros, to the hometown main event, the whole thing was electric, and much of it centered around the young contender from New Zealand. Let us know in the comment section if this was the time you fell in love with Adesanya, or if you have another moment that stands out. Man, did he knock it out of the park that night. A devastating and perfectly timed punch put Whittaker down at 3:33 of round number 2. I hate to admit it, but I'm old enough to clearly remember Mike Tyson knocking out Trevor Berbick to become the youngest heavyweight champion in boxing history. The announcer said, "And we have a new era in boxing." That's how it felt that night when Adesanya won the title. He was a fresh new face with an exciting style. He went on to defend twice against Yoel Romero and Paulo Costa in polar opposite performances, more on that in a minute, before suffering the first loss of his professional career in an overly ambitious move to light heavyweight. Now, it's worth noting that there were issues with Izzy's performances, even in his meteoric rise to superstardom. One thing that Izzy has never accomplished in his UFC career: 2 knockouts in a row. Now, that's not a knock on his skill set. Most fighters find their KO ratio plummeting after they step onto the world's biggest combat sports stage. But Izzy wouldn't just win by decision. He would often have lackluster, I would even say boring fights in between highlight reel performances. By the time the Blachowicz fight came around, it was becoming increasingly clear that if a fighter didn't come at him guns blazing like Costa or Gastelum, then Izzy was content to control range and play it safe. His title defense against Yoel Romero was an insomnia cure. I still watch it when I need a good night's sleep and melatonin just isn't doing the trick. Puts me out every time. Also, he had some issues with his versatility. Now, this may seem obvious to hardcore MMA fans, but Izzy had fantastic striking. His wrestling was basic at best, and his submission game was virtually non-existent. But he also lacked the deadly clinch game that made Anderson Silva such a threat to fighters who could close distance. His striking relied heavily on his ability to keep fighters at mid and long range where he could pick his shots with ease. He didn't like being physically crowded, and that was about to become a serious problem. It's almost taken for granted in today's MMA landscape that you can't truly be great until you win in multiple weight classes. I could spend several hours talking about the merits of this idea, and hey, comment enough on this video and I might. But it's fairly firmly entrenched that GOATs have to do it in multiple weight classes in the UFC to be remembered as all-time greats. So it didn't come as a huge surprise that an ambitious fighter like Izzy would try his hand at the 205-pound division against Jan Blachowicz in 2021. The first clue that there would be a problem was the fact that he weighed far under the light heavyweight limit of 205 pounds, tipping the scale just over 200. Now, I've been next to Izzy a few times in my MMA broadcasting career. He's a tall, lanky middleweight, but he isn't one of those guys whom you can hardly believe makes 185. He just doesn't have the frame to physically compete with the monsters at 205. And boy, did this fight show that. Also, moving up in weight class takes time. It's hard to safely and successfully put on an extra 20 to 30 pounds of lean muscle. A fighter who moves up in weight right away just doesn't skip the weight cut. They actively gain weight above the new weight class and cut down. John Jones famously took 3 years to gain proper heavyweight size. Yeah, I know there was more to that, but that's a different video. Izzy fought at 185 a mere 5 months before his shot at light heavyweight gold. That's nowhere near enough time to do it right. The easy summary of the fight is that Izzy got manhandled. He lost a fairly pedestrian unanimous decision and was taken down consistently and easily by the much bigger Blachowicz. But beyond the size disparity, Izzy also looked like his ground skills were limited and that once he was denied his precious striking space, he didn't have a ton of offensive answers. He also seemed a bit resigned early in the fight that things weren't going to go his way. The heart he had shown in the Gastelum fight was nowhere to be found. A lot of people simply assumed that since he wasn't in danger of losing his title, that he might not have been that emotionally involved in the outcome. With his experiment over at 205, Izzy went back to work, adding to his legacy at middleweight. He won his next 3 fights, 2 of them being rematches. He won all of them by decision in performances that left a lot to be desired in terms of action. I was calling Money in the Bank for the WWE in Vegas when he beat Jared Cannonier. I vividly remember his Undertaker-themed walk-in, but I have completely forgotten the fight itself. He played it safe yet again and won a comfortable decision in front of the WWE brass. We didn't know it at the time, but this was the peak of Izzy's career. In his 2 fights with Alex Pereira, we saw the best and worst of Izzy. The key in the first fight was that Alex knew how to beat Izzy. He had defeated him twice in kickboxing and seemed to have the antidote for Izzy's style. It's said all the time in fighting: you box a brawler, you brawl a boxer. Alex used his size and chin to walk Izzy down and take away the middle distance that he needs to get his shots off and feel comfortable. Another thing Alex knew is that being uncomfortable is tiring. Izzy was winning early rounds by sticking and moving, and even utilizing the occasional takedown, but it was costing him a lot of gas. Pereira found his moment and finished a faded Adesanya in the 5th round. The heart Izzy displayed in defeat and the fact that he wanted an immediate rematch showed that he still had a champion's will. Him finding the perfect countershot knockout in round number 2 also showed he was still incredibly dangerous and immensely talented. Unfortunately, the map to defeat Izzy had been written by Pereira, and the top fighters and coaches would follow it in his next 2 outings. I never subscribed to the Izzy had an off night with Strickland argument. I was shocked when it happened live. Like most people, I had picked Izzy to win. But having watched it several times since, I have to tip my hat to Strickland and Eric Nixick, his coach, for following a perfect path to a huge upset. Just like Pereira, Strickland took the physical space away from Izzy while firing shots every time the champ tried to set his feet and counter. He was busy, he was awkward, and his gas tank never faltered. Aside from a brief rally in round 2, this fight belonged to Strickland from start to finish. Izzy's time off before the Duplessis fight might have been the right step. Poker players call it playing on tilt. It's when a player is on a losing streak and they start playing emotionally and losing more. I've seen it happen countless times in my career. Fighter loses a big fight, usually for a title, and they want to jump back in ASAP to get the taste out of their mouths. Unfortunately, they often lose that one as well, and the decline is almost inevitable. Izzy took almost a year off before challenging Dricus du Plessis for the middleweight crown. The negative side of that decision is that Izzy is a timing fighter. He relies on precise placement of his shots and clockwork combinations. That is a style that typically doesn't do well after a long layoff. It's repetition in the gym and in the octagon that makes a style like Izzy's work, and his schedule had been very busy over the previous years. Since his UFC debut, he had averaged just over 2.5 fights per year, a solid schedule considering much of that was as a defending champion. Also, the world was catching up to Izzy. He was in his mid-30s and had lost 2 out of his last 3. He needed to add tools to his toolkit before taking on Dricus du Plessis. If you spend a year in the gym without the pressure of an actual camp, that gives you plenty of time to add some new wrinkles to your already formidable arsenal. Teaching an older dog new tricks is never easy. By the time most champions get a title, they are fairly set in their MMA ways, and Izzy was no exception. In his showdown with du Plessis, he looked sharp, but was still fighting with roughly the same offense as before. A lot of people were turned off by the trash talk with DDP.
What the f*** are you even on about?
My God. It's obviously a see and tell. We can see that. What do you mean? You're saying that I made it
shut
about...
the f***. You don't even know anything about my story. You have no idea who the f*** I am.
care about your story.
You don't know my story. Don't speak of my story if you don't know my story.
I don't care
I will show you who you are Sunday. So right now, shut the f*** up.
I can't wait.
Bye, let's see.
The argument about who was more African, of course, touched on some dark territory concerning the colonial history of Africa. But as far as tactics for a fight were concerned, I don't think it had a huge effect. Izzy isn't a trash talker like Conor or Strickland, but he had a good war of words with Costa before blowing him out and had some sharp back and forth with Strickland before his loss. All in all, he seems to not fight in an emotional way, regardless of what is said outside of the octagon. Unfortunately for his fans, Adesanya's comeback was not to be. It wasn't like he was a shadow of his former self that night, but he was behind on all 3 judges' scorecards before being finished with a face crank in round 4. As it stands in fall of 2024, Israel Adesanya has now lost 3 of his last 4 fights and has only fought 3 times in the last 2 years. So where does he go from here? Well, that's a difficult question. One thing to keep in mind is a discussion I once had with MMA OG Yves Edwards about Santiago Ponzinibbio. If you don't remember, he was a welterweight contender before suffering a series of injuries that kept him out of the octagon for 2 years. He is 2-5 since his return, and his contender days are long gone. When I asked Yves about this, he said that divisions move fast these days. Santiago may be 100% physically, but the time he had to take off may have given the division itself time to move past his skill set. Divisions move in the direction of the champion. Now, what I mean by this is that a champion like Izzy, during his run, has to think about a variety of different styles and opponents. No contender is set in stone, and things can change at the last minute, especially if you're fighting Khamzat Chimaev for some reason. So, a champ has to have a variable game plan for a certain opponent, while improving his own game. Challengers only have to think about one man, the champ. As a result, MMA coaches all over the world are constantly trying to figure out how to get past the defense and counter the offense of one guy. If you are that guy, in this case, a reigning Israel Adesanya, you have to work twice as hard to stay ahead of a hungry, motivated, and increasingly skilled pack of potential challengers. Not only is that a difficult physical task, it is also emotionally exhausting. Imagine in whatever line of work you do, that every day a dozen people showed up at your school, office, or work site with resumes in hand, demanding your job, and the only thing keeping them at bay was your performance that day. Most of us would fold pretty quickly under that kind kind of pressure. But that's the reality of not just being a champion, but a general star who is well known outside of the general fight fan base. Izzy had the position that everyone in the fight game dreams of, and he defended it well for almost 4 years. You get the feeling, however, that it was starting to take a toll at the end of his championship run. He spoke openly about motivation and lapping the field with rematches against former foes. He seemed to want new challenges, but didn't seem to have the answers when those new challenges arrived in the form of Strickland and Duplessis. It also bears keeping in mind that at 35, Izzy isn't exactly a spring chicken. Sure, some MMA fighters are competitive, if not dominant in their mid-30s, but rarely are they stand-up specialists with a style that requires speed, timing, and agility. 3 attributes that rarely age well. Fighters like Anderson Silva, Roy Jones Jr., Sergio Martinez, all unorthodox fighters with dynamic styles, went off a cliff when age and miles eroded their once lightning reflexes. Also, as a great man once said, "It ain't the years, honey. It's the mileage." Izzy started his pro fighting career in a kickboxing ring 14 years ago and has 108 pro fights in MMA and kickboxing to his credit. No one goes through that many fights with their body intact at 35. The camps get harder, recovery becomes more of an issue, and the risk versus reward factors of getting through the tough moments of a fight become much more skewed on the side of risk. It's also worth noting that Izzy didn't get through his contender and title runs without going to war. He took serious damage in the wins over Gastelum and Pereira, and in the losses to Strickland, Pereira, and DDP. Since his last loss to Dricus du Plessis, there's also a video circulating of Izzy getting in an altercation with someone on the street. Now, it looks like this is a drunk person's fault. What I like about this is Izzy doesn't take the bait and lay him out. I don't know why these people want to pick fights with MMA celebrities. Maybe the guy didn't know who Izzy was. But the point is, Izzy didn't lay him out, didn't get arrested, he didn't get hot-headed and cause a bigger problem than the one that was already in front of him. Shows his judgment is okay and makes me feel better about his retirement. He's not going to be in bars doing stupid things. There are 2 sides to any comeback talk as we sit here in the fall of 2024 examining the career of Israel Adesanya. The first is that the man has shown a fair amount of resilience in his fighting career. While it's tempting to look back at his failure to win gold at 205 as a proverbial beginning of the end, he rebounded from his one-sided loss to Jan Blachowicz to win 3 in a row at 185. He also bravely took on a guy in Alex Pereira who had beaten him 3 straight times, 2 by knockout, to reclaim his middleweight title in a devastating knockout, in what might have been the greatest performance of his career when it's all said and done. Pereira is currently the 205-pound champion and is considering a try at heavyweight, and Izzy laid him out. There is no questioning the man's ability to overcome a tenacious and dangerous opponent. So maybe he can overcome this sizable bump in the road he is facing now. Of all of his losses at 185, only the Strickland fight was really one-sided. Fighters like Randy Couture, Dustin Poirier, and Max Holloway have faced bigger setbacks and had startling career comebacks. On the other side lies a truly deep question. Why would he come back? I can only assume from the fact that he drives a Lamborghini around that he has made enough money to set him up for the rest of his life. Sure, fighters aren't known for their great financial planning strategies, but I haven't heard anything about him blowing through his money in any kind of dangerous fashion where fighting would become a financial necessity. In his time at the top of the UFC, he made huge paydays for MMA. If you even put a fraction of that income away, he should be fine. Also, beyond any financial considerations, he was the cover of the video game star of the sport who took on the cream of the crop at 185. In order to earn his way back to a title shot after 2 straight losses, he will have to take on some hungry, up-and-coming contenders and look impressive doing it. Remember that plenty of people were upset that he slid right back into a title fight after the Strickland loss. Celebrity may have its privileges, but it also has a shelf life. Izzy is simply past the point where he can get a title shot in any weight class without paying dues again. And does he have the motivation to do that? Climbing to the top of the mountain in MMA is a thrilling challenge when you're in your prime and as hungry as a starving lion. The camps are still difficult but rewarding. You get to see your skill set improve by leaps and bounds with every session, and the thrill of victory is exhilarating every time. The championship run means more money, fame, and respect, but it also means fighting becomes a job. You are now a consummate professional, honing your craft with huge stakes in every fight. At the end, you are somewhere back at the start, and that's where Izzy finds himself now. He's at the bottom of a mountain, once again looking at the peak. The difference now is that he used to live there, and he knows what the view is like. There are no more mysteries, no more mystique about having gold around your waist. He has older legs and is now carrying bags full of money. Is it really worth the climb?